Let's welcome George Etheridge to the stage.
It's Sunday, June 20th, 2021. Here in Detroit, Michigan, we are 15 months into the COVID-19 global pandemic. We had recently memorialized my wife's grandmother and grandfather, both having passed from COVID. On this particular Sunday, I'm sitting in the living room of my childhood home just 3 miles down the road from where we are now, and I've got 2 video cameras set up on tripods and softbox lights and portable microphones, all trained on my dad, a man who had survived open heart surgery and had recently been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease and has now contracted COVID twice. You see, I am determined to capture my dad's life story while there's still time and the clock is ticking. With everything prepped and set to go, I asked the first question, "All right, Dad, what's your name?" He didn't hear me. Despite being on 15 different kinds of medication and walking with a cane and having had cataract surgery and open heart surgery and battling debilitating anxiety and arthritis and depression and Parkinson's, he refused to get a hearing aid because he thought it would make him look old. So I asked the question again, this time a little louder. "Dad, what is your name?" And he says in a clear, heavily accented Southern voice, punctuated by the fact that he was not wearing his dentures, "My name is Leroy Etheridge." Now, I'm a Northern boy, Detroit born and raised, and I cannot do my father's voice justice. But I will tell you, when I was a kid, I got into a whole lot of fights because the other kids on the block always said my dad sounded like Elmer Fudd. Question number 2, when were you born? He answers, "I was born January 16th, 1944. All right, question number 3, where were you born? On a train? On a what? He says, "I was born on a train between New York and Columbia, South Carolina." Now, he's got me hooked at this point. I'm like, okay, I'm 39 years old at the time of this interview, and I've never heard this story before. Tell me more. He says, "My father, your grandfather, George, who you were named for, was a red cap for the train company, and sometimes he'd bring his family on trips with him, and this time he brought his very pregnant wife, Sarah, who gave birth to me in the segregated color car of the Silver Meter train." I'm like, wow, Dad, was there like a doctor on the train, a nurse, a midwife, or did Grandma Sarah just have you in the middle of the aisle? He said, "I don't know, but what I do know is when we rode into the next station in Greensboro, North Carolina, they transferred us to the nearest colored hospital 3 hours away." Again, I'm hooked. I'm like, wow, Dad, so tell me, what was it like growing up in the South? And with a look of reflection and horror in his eyes, he says, "The South, that's no place you want it to be. Most racist place on earth." Now, I'm expecting my dad to go into some Tales of Huckleberry Finn type stories, but instead we're sitting there in this weighty silence, and I'm like, okay, next question, I guess. So, Granddad was a red cap. What did Grandma Sarah do for a living? He says, "Your grandmother was a cook in the governor's mansion in Columbia, South Carolina." I'm like, wow. And then he hits me with, not just any governor, the KKK card-carrying member Strom Thurmond. I'm like, At this time, I'm imagining my grandmother in a white apron and headscarf, looking like a character from Gone with the Wind. But then my daddy hits me with this story. He says, I remember when I was a boy, me and your uncles were standing in line waiting to have dinner at the governor's mansion. You know, once a year, they'd open up the doors to the community, black, white, didn't matter. And we're standing in line, and your grandmother was a cook there, and she told us to come on down and get something to eat because she was not cooking a second meal when she got home. And we're in line for 2-3 hours, and these drunken white boys come by, and they're trying to force us to the back of the line. They're grabbing us and they're pulling us. And, the governor, he was out there and he was shaking hands, and he saw what was happening to Miss Sarah's boys. That's what he called us, Miss Sarah's boys. And he grabbed those crackers by the ear, put foot to butt, and dragged them to the back of the line. I'm like, wow, Dad, this is what, the 40s, 50s? Weren't you scared they was going to string you up? My dad looked at me and said, I ain't never been scared of a fight. And what's right is right. When I worked in Washington, D.C. for the United States Senate, I had the opportunity of meeting Senator Thurman. He had to be 93 years old at the time. And I shared this story with him, and he looked at me like he ain't know what the hell I was talking about. But he remembered my grandmother Sarah, and he remembered her cooking. Now, you got to understand, trying to get these stories about my dad growing up in the South was like pulling teeth. But before I could ask my next question, he says, I'll never forget one Easter Sunday, April 6, 1958. I was 14 years old, and me and my brothers were walking home from church wearing our Sunday's best, and there was a huge crowd of folks crossing Main Street, and there were these 2 white cops. And some knuckleheaded fool in the crowd yelled out, "Fuck the police!" And everybody stopped and looking around, and the police zeroed in on me. I don't know if it was because I was the biggest one in the crowd, 14 years old, nearly 6 feet tall, lean, pure muscle, but with their billy clubs in hand, they forced me into a nearby alley, and they beat me. I see tears welling up in my dad's eyes, and me, I got a lump in my throat, and my mouth's gone dry, and then he says the most astonishing thing. He says, somehow, some way, crawling on my hands and knees, being beaten and kicked and called nigger, I managed to grab hold of a metal garbage can lid. And that is the only thing that saved my life. And they had the nerve to arrest me for assaulting a police officer and disturbing the peace. Tears are stinging my eyes, and I am pissed. And I'm like, did someone come and help you, or did they just leave you there? And he says, no, but not all white folks are bad. There was this one police officer, everybody called him Mustache Slim. And my brothers ran off to find him, and by the time they came back and pulled those white cops off of me, they said I was barely recognizable. Scared the hell out of my mama. And then my dad says, when George Floyd happened, all I can think is that could have been me. I'm like, what happened next? He says, well, the next day was my arraignment. I'll never forget, I was before Judge Wright, and I remember him sitting up there on that bench looking down at me and said, boy, don't you know you can't go around here whooping on white police officers? You need to be out here whipping on other niggas. Instead of sentencing my father to 6 months in the Richland County Correctional Home for Boys, he sentenced him to 3 days. Unfortunately, due to the racist laws of the South, with that 3 days on my dad's record, he was unable to re-enroll in school. I'd asked him about this, and he said, I really wanted to go back to school. By my dad standing up to defend himself, he was limited to an 8th grade education. Or so the racist South thought. Loophole, don't knock trade schools. My father proudly said I was certified in the culinary arts at the Richland Wright Vocational School in Columbia, South Carolina. Now, this was a revelation to me because growing up, all my dad did was cook. You know that one house on the block when you're out playing with your friends and you can smell when it's dinner time? Yeah, that was our house. Everybody wanted an invitation to dinner, and my dad, he kept an open door policy. Hell, kids I didn't even like came over for dinner. So at this point of the interview, I'm like, okay, you've been beaten, you've been locked up, you've been kicked out of school, so you're done with the South, right? My dad says, yeah, at the age of 17 in 1962, right before my 18th birthday, I moved to Detroit, Michigan. I'm like, all right, so when you first moved to Detroit, what neighborhood did you want to live in? He says, dreamy-eyed, University District. I always loved that neighborhood. Now, my dad, he was a huge Motown fan. Part of the reason he moved to Detroit, couldn't sing a lick, but he always wanted to be where the stars were. You had David Ruffin on Parkside, you had Gladys Knight on LaSalle and Martin Park, and he even became really good friends with Jackie Wilson. Sorry, not Smokey Robinson. But unfortunately, my father's resources did not match his aspirations. So I'd asked him, what kind of work did you do? And he said, like most folks, I came up north and got hired in with GM, building engine blocks. I'm like, that's it. That's what got us to the middle class. But Dad, I have no recollection of you ever working for General Motors. He says, before you were born, I had taken a family trip down to South Carolina and came back to Detroit and no job. I'd stayed away one day too long and got fired. They told me they'd hire me back, but I'd have to start all over again, and I wasn't doing that. Growing up, I'd always wondered why we weren't an automotive middle-class family. Now I knew. So now, like with every other longtime Detroiter, I had to ask my dad about 1967. Being a lifelong Detroiter myself, I have a natural curiosity about where folks were during the start of the rebellion. My dad says, 1967, I was living in an apartment at Linwood and Gladstone. Yeah, I was there with my first wife, Ophelia, and your older brother. Now, in the 60s, I was very active. I was a member of the Black Panther Party and the Shrine of the Black Madonna. And early in the 60s, I even studied with Malcolm X at Mosque No. 1 on Linwood. I'm looking at my dad like, who are you? And then he says, I remember the tanks rolling down the streets. And I remember hearing the National Guard on the loudspeaker saying, stay away from the windows and the doors. Keep your lights off. And I went into the kitchen. I just put your brother down for the night, and I was getting a beer from the refrigerator. And as soon as that refrigerator light popped on, a bullet came smashing through the window right above my head. And Ophelia came running out, turning on lights to see what's going on, and a second bullet came through that window and hit the wall. Hell, Ophelia, she was done. She couldn't take the North, and me, I refused to go back to the South. My father goes on to tell me that he did not know at the time that Ophelia was pregnant with my sister, who coincidentally, like my father, was born on a train. No, I'm just messing with you. Yeah. So that relationship didn't last. The next question I asked was, when did you move into your current house? He says, in 1977, right after your brother was born. I was on my second marriage to Yolanda Emerson. The apartment complex had a rule against too many kids. I'm like, so what was this neighborhood like when you first moved here? College Park? Oh, George, it was beautiful. We were one of 3 black families on the block. You had us. I was working at Sinai Hospital as a dietary nutritionist. Right next door, you had Ben Bailey, who was one of the few black engineers at Ford Motor Company. And at the corner, you had Mr. Gilchrist. Yeah, that one, the grandfather of our lieutenant governor. Within 2 months of us moving in, every other house had a U-Haul truck out front. So at this point of the interview, I'm helping my dad up. We've been going at it for a while, taking a bathroom break. And in the hallway, there's a framed copy of Yolanda's obituary. And I'd ask my dad, "Dad, what happened to Yolanda?" He says, she got sick with a rare form of cancer. And from the time she was diagnosed to the time she passed, it was only 3 months. So here you have my dad with 2 boys under the age of 5, grieving the loss of his second wife. At this point, I'm sniffling, I'm snotting. I'm like, "You need a tissue?" He's like, "No, I'm good." He smiles and he nods. And I'm like, "Okay, so when did you meet my mom, Brenda?" He says, "About a year after Yolanda passed, through a mutual friend. We went out to the bar, and your mama, she don't drink. And she asked me if we went on a second date, I had to take her to church. And your brothers hearing this said, 'Church,' and they thought churches, and said, 'Bring us back some chicken and fries.'" So obviously, things worked out. My younger brother and I are children number 5 and 6. And my mother will attest that after 42 years of marriage, my father was a provider, and she never had to cook a meal if she didn't want to. Now, my father would always say that the kitchen is where he felt most at home. From the time that he was 9 years old, standing on a Pepsi-Cola crate flipping hamburgers in a sandwich shop in the middle of a train station in Columbia, South Carolina, until the time we had to force him to stop cooking because he damn near burnt down the house one night while cooking in his sleep. Watch those medications. Cooking has always been a defining characteristic. My youngest son, 6 years old, said recently to my wife, "Dad cooks for us because that's how he shows us he loves us." And I like to think that I inherited that from my father, who inherited that from his mother. 15 days before my dad passed, my wife and I moved him and my mother into our new family home in University District. My father passed on April 3rd of 2022 at the age of 77. And in his words, it was a good day. He woke up early that morning, he got himself dressed and ate breakfast and made the 70-mile drive to Swartz Creek, Michigan, where my mother pastors a small church. The clock was ticking. Later that day, my wife and I did some grocery shopping, and she ensured that we bought all of the ingredients for my dad's favorite meals, at least the ones that I was willing to cook because I ain't cooking no damn chitlins. I made the mistake of buying a sweet bottle of wine that my wife couldn't stand, but when I poured a glass for my dad, he took a sip and said, "This is good. I don't know what she's talking about." And he leaned back in his lazy boy recliner and kicked up his feet, and the clock was ticking. About 4:30 that afternoon, my father began to complain about chest pains, and I can hear him upstairs arguing with my mom, and I'm thinking, "Oh, Lord, here we go again. It's time for his daily panic attack," because, he's dealing with that severe anxiety, and the clock was ticking. And then I hear my mother calling for help because my father was unconscious and unresponsive. And the clock was ticking, and I'm rushing to the room, and I'm yelling for my wife to call 911. "Where's my phone? I can't find my damn phone." And the clock was ticking. And I'm guessing that my father's defibrillator kicked in because he was conscious, but he was dazed and confused, and we hear the sirens wailing, and he looks at me and says, "Is that for me?" And I say, "Yeah, Dad, that's for you. Welcome to your new neighborhood." And the clock was ticking. The clock stopped at 7:16 p.m. that day. I've always loved the quote, "Time is the most valuable thing a man can spend." That last 15 days under the same roof with my children, was one of the most precious gifts my father could have provided. To this day, we keep a seat for him at the table. And when I go home tonight, after I leave this stage, I'm going to cook. Thank you.
George, thank you. Just thank you.